Hello and welcome to the F1 Report testing special from the paddock in Barcelona. The second and final test is just about to come to a close. And ahead of the checkered flag, I'm joined here in the Haas F1 motorhome by F1 Racing Magazine editor Anthony Rowlinson and NBC Sports' Will Buxton. Welcome to you both, and thanks very much to Haas F1 for hosting us here. Will, I'm sure you've been busy with Haas F1, haven't you? The first American team in Formula One for many, many years. But on that and the rest of testing, what have you made of it?
Impressed, I think is the word that's come over the last 8 days with not only Haas and what they've been able to do as a new team, but with every team up and down this pit lane. We look back 2 years to testing and teams not able to get 2-3 laps out of the cars, and here day by day you look down at Toro Rosso, they're running 160, 150 laps a day, absolutely no problem, just an incredible run. Incredible
is the word, isn't it, Anthony? Because I mean, between us we've covered about 160, 170 tests. And I remember going to Silverstone or Jerez or wherever, and people weren't running because the cars were breaking down. None of that now.
This year it's been amazing. Someone came out with a stat this morning that Mercedes have actually completed a season's worth of laps in 2 weeks already, which is quite mind-blowing. And it's only now that Lewis is starting to get a few reliability issues with his car. So yeah, it's staggering actually.
No, indeed. Okay, plenty more to come in the show. Here's what's coming up. We reflect on a busy 2 weeks of testing to try and work out the 2016 pecking order. We'll ask whether anyone has gained ground on Mercedes. And we look at Ferrari's version of the Halo head protection concept, whose design has split the opinion of both the paddock and the fans. But only one place to start off, I suppose, and that's with the reigning world champions, Mercedes-AMG Petronas, to give them their full name. And we should give them full credit, shouldn't we? How have you assessed their testing so far, Anthony?
They are awesome. We mustn't write off the season before it started, and Ferrari have come on strong in this test. It's clear that Ferrari will provide them with the challenge, but they are clear favourites. Lewis looks sharp, Nico looks sharp, the team are just completely slick, nailed on. There's no apparent weakness, and they're just building on strength, sort of layer upon layer of excellence. I think we'll look back on this era as one of those times when a team came to define its sport. This will be the Mercedes era, and I think we're going to have a season of being very impressed by what they do.
You mentioned Lewis and Nico. Have you noticed any difference between the two? Nico's consistently been faster, but you can never tell anything from the times.
It was exactly the same last year, though, and that sort of carried through into practice in Australia as well. And I think Nico thought he had the advantage over Lewis, and Lewis was almost sort of playing the rope-a-dope, just laying back, and testing doesn't matter to Lewis, practice doesn't matter to Lewis. He got into qualifying and bam, half a second. Lewis has been inching to put in some fast laps throughout the test. He tried this morning, but when you look at the team, they only brought 4 sets of softs over the 8 days. Every other set of tyres they've run is medium. Is that confidence, or is that just getting the work done and knowing that the medium is the most consistent tyre at which to gain a proper understanding of that car?
What can stop them? They've had a little reliability today on the last day.
I think what could unsettle them is the driver dynamics, and Toto's referred to this in public at the end of last year, and privately during the off-season he said that, if the drivers don't play nicely, one of them will have to leave the team. And if Nico starts as strongly as he finished last year, I'm not sure if that will happen, but if he does, Lewis will find himself under pressure, and then the team could start to wobble internally. I mean, that to me is the biggest threat they face.
Yeah, I do, but I also think that the sort of pressure from the fan base will come to bear on Mercedes, that they've got to allow their drivers to race one another. They've got to allow their drivers to formulate their own strategies and actually take it to each other, because if their advantage is as great as we think it is, and they're not allowed to fight, by the end of the first lap strategy is determined, that's going to be no fun for anyone.
How are the other teams going to be feeling then?
I mean, Ferrari are always confident because they're Ferrari, aren't they? And this is now year 2 of a sort of James Allison technical setup at Ferrari. You can see that starting to bed down. I mean, Kimi said he's got the car feeling the way he likes it, and motivated Kimi is still got a world champion in that car, even if he's not quite the force he once was. I think Seb Vettel's one of the top. He's in that elite group of top 3 drivers with Alonso and Lewis. Seb will be seeing this year as an opportunity to pick up what he did last year, which was a tremendous season for Ferrari, and I think he'll fancy his chance of doing maybe like an 86 style what Alain Prost did to Williams, in a slightly less quick car, nevertheless was more consistent over a season, divided the other 2 drivers and won a title. I think that's the way Seb will approach this year.
Last question about the Mercedes drivers before we get on to Ferrari. Is this, I know we keep saying it, make or break for Rosberg, but in terms of a championship, if he does not win this year's championship, A, does he stay at Mercedes after being beaten 3 years in a row by Lewis? Or B, what does he do? Do you think it's make or break?
I don't think it's in his hands. I mean, in terms of where it's in his hands in terms of what he can do this year, but he can give as good as he can, and he has done over the last 2 years, and he's been roundly beaten. If he doesn't beat Lewis again this year, what I mean is it won't be in his hands, in that the team will determine whether they keep him on or not. If they don't, then he's clearly there as a number. Sorry, if they do, then he's there as a number 2 driver.
And if they don't keep him, Alonso?
Oof, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Now that would be something very interesting for the sport, wouldn't it? Alonso against a dominant Lewis Hamilton in the bring it on, because I'd love to see that. That would be fantastic.
And more importantly, Bernie Ecclestone would love to see that.
Yeah, he would.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Ferrari then. The best of the rest at the moment. What's been your assessment of Ferrari's winter testing?
It's been good. It's been solid, but there are worries that the engine hasn't proved as reliable as the Mercedes power unit. It's definitely a step up. The straight line speed is definitely an improvement, but there are niggles. And Ferrari, it's kind of like in football. As soon as you get the backing of the board, you know there's a problem. Ferrari have been going around telling everybody we have no problems with our power unit, which instantly makes you think, well, there's possibly a few things they're not 100% with.
Yeah, they said to me, we haven't had any repeat problems, and of the problems they have had, oh well, that's what testing's for. And that might have been a good excuse 20 years ago maybe, but the complexities of these cars and these power units means that there might be a little bit of a season-long or an early season trouble there.
Yeah, I think, Ferrari will have had a remit to push the limits with this car, because clearly they're in catch-up mode. They're against a very, very dominant team. And if you are pushing, that's where compromises come in. They've taken a few risks with the car. I mean, the chassis looks very good. Both drivers are saying how well it handles, and the times that it's produced, admittedly on super soft tyres, are headline-grabbing times. But it's clearly, the second best machine, and it probably will. Well, I'm sure it will win races.
But it's not just Ferrari themselves, their customers as well have been suffering with engine woes. Haas, Sauber, they've all had little niggles. The only Ferrari team that hasn't is Toro Rosso, which looks bulletproof at the moment, but they're running a year-old unit.
And picking up on what we were saying about Vettel versus Raikkonen, new pushrod front suspension seems to be suiting Kimi more than the last ones. Where do we see the balance there?
I don't think it'll change very much. Sadly, no. I'm a big Kimi fan. I respect what he's achieved over the years, but Seb's a phenomenal driver, and I think he's just in a different league to what Kimi has been. And Kimi will still have his day. He'll probably be great at Spa. He was very strong at Hungary last year until his car broke. He might slip a win in somewhere, but I don't think he'll probably be allowed to beat Vettel in that team either.
Allowed.
So. That's where I think Kimi will be.
Yeah, I think Kimi's just very lucky. He's still got the drive, to be completely honest with you, because I think the driver that Ferrari wanted to put in the car this year, sadly they couldn't, because he isn't with us. And the other options for them were either under contract or weren't quite ready to be placed in. So yeah, Kimi's got to do something ridiculously special this year to still be around next season. Okay,
all right. Well, as we've been mentioning, a Ferrari customer partner, you might say, is our host for the day, Haas F1. What have you made of their second test? And this is really where you could say character is tested for a new team.
Massively. I think, if you don't mind me going back to the first test very quickly, even getting the car on track, even getting it to run a lap, when you look at the struggles that experienced championship winning teams have had with this new technology, for a brand new team to turn up, yes, as a customer and taking a lot of their parts in, but to get it on track, get it running, unbelievably impressive to do that. And yeah, here it's been a reality check, but that is what testing is for. With only 8 days, they needed every lap, every minute out on track. It's proved very, very trying for them. But as a young team, that's what's going to draw them together. And they'll arrive in Melbourne with a better knowledge of the car and what can go wrong. There'll be a tighter, more cohesive unit. This is all the building of a family that's going to go forward together. I think it was needed.
I'd agree with every word that Will has said. I've just been hugely impressed by the way they've gone about it. I mean, there's some scepticism about whether they could make their model work, having Dallara build the chassis, Ferrari back end, if you like, and listed parts, logistics in the UK, money from the US. How is that all going to come together? And they've proven it's possible. They look entirely credible and pretty slick, actually. I'm really impressed.
They've got the gear, haven't they? They've got the money as well. They certainly haven't scrimped on any of this. Is then the key thing, do you think, that building of a team, bringing people together, and that will decide whether they sink or swim. Also, because they don't actually have any comparative data, do they? That's one thing. They can't look at last year's tyre data and say, oh, well, we think it's going to do this or that or the other.
But they've been very clever. They've drawn in their staff from almost every team up and down this pit lane. They've pulled out some of the best engineers and mechanics out of GP2 as well. There's many familiar faces in this team with a lot of experience. You know, this isn't a rookie team of guys coming over. You know, they haven't just plucked their NASCAR team and put them into Formula One with no knowledge of this sport.
Two very, very decent drivers, you know.
Yeah, two competent drivers. Grosjean, who took, you know, Grosjean's up there with Hülkenberg as one of those guys you think has a Formula One World Championship in him in the right car. Massive risk to come here, and he's put it all online, and you know he can't afford to let it fail.
Well, is the good thing, just finally on this, Anthony, about Grosjean, is that he can take the rough with the smooth, and especially when he's had to. The third day here, he caused 3 red flags, but that won't affect him presumably very much.
I think Grosjean's a really interesting driver these days because he's been through some tough times. He knows how to handle bad days in a Formula One car, and what he gives Haas is an absolute barometer of what that car's capable of, because he is one of the quick guys. So they know if that car's lapping whatever lap time it can produce with Grosjean at the wheel, that's what it'll do. No one will make it go much faster, and that's very useful for a new team because they're not worrying about the driver input. They know that bit's sorted.
I just want to add on Grosjean. We've been very lucky getting some behind the scenes stuff with Haas this week, given that we broadcast in the States. And when he did have one of his offs yesterday, he brought it in, had a bit of a joke with Gunther. You know, at least I kept it out of the barrier. But then, while all the boys were hard at work getting the car back together, he was right at the front, polishing it, cleaning it off, getting properly stuck in, and making sure that he's a part of the team. He's with all the boys. You can imagine he probably went out, brought them all a whole bunch of beers, and brought them back for them. But yeah, he was at the front of the car, polishing it, cleaning it, making it sure it was ready for him to go back out again.
Okay, gents, thanks very much for now. Still to come, we rate the rest of the teams, and we have a look at the new Halo head protection concept. Hello again, welcome back to the F1 Report testing special from Barcelona. Now, by the end of day 3 of this second test, all the teams combined had covered 23,419 miles, which equates to 122 Spanish Grand Prix together. And with so much ground to cover, we asked McLaren racing director Eric Boulier exactly how the teams come up with a run plan.
I mean, these days, because we have a very few number of days of testing, we have a very, very heavy program. So we have a head of race operations, which is leading, in fact, if you want, all the race team. And every department in the company is suggesting or making a request about a test, about data gather problems or issue or whatever. And this is then built up through a test plan in terms of priority. So every day is different, but very busy, and each run we have different tests during the same lap. So this is why there is a time to chase, let's say, a fast lap time, but most of the time in testing, which is boring for the fans, it's because we are spending and doing rounds around the track just to gather data or to make some tests for some people or department or whoever needs to get some information in the company.
Well, NBC Sports' Will Buxton and F1 Racing Magazine editor Anthony Rowlinson are still with us. Anthony, to you first on McLaren, do you think we'll see a more competitive season from them?
They're bound to be better, I think, because last year was a sort of a nadir for that team. Honda have clearly made progress over the winter. They've got Jos Capito arriving as CEO later in the season. He comes from Volkswagen. He's run a very successful motorsport program for Volkswagen. So I think the team are getting back to some kind of shape, but they've still got problems. The lap times aren't there. They look a lot more reliable than they did this time last year, and vastly more reliable. There's been no stellar lap times though at all. So yes, they'll be more competitive, but I think they'll struggle to get points, certainly in the first half of the season.
Do you think they've actually changed the order any? I mean, where did we finish Abu Dhabi? Do you remember Alonso put a new set of tyres on at the end and set, what was it, the second fastest race lap? And they were just outside the top 10. You think they're still just outside the top 10 or top 10-ish?
The problem is they lack top-end speed. They have sorted out their hybrid issues because you remember last year they weren't able to deploy for the full lap. I believe they've got on top of that, but when you're still lacking in whatever it is and it's double digits in a straight line, you can't compete, and that's their biggest problem right now. But as you say, it couldn't get much worse than it did last year, so any improvement has got to be a good thing for them.
Talking of double digits, we had some information from ExxonMobil, Esso, their fuel supplier, which said that They brought a double-digit horsepower gain with a new fuel that they brought to testing here. How important is it to have your own dedicated fuel supplier? They all have it. Ferrari have Shell, of course. Mercedes have Petronas. And the relationship is ever closer, isn't it?
I'd like to know what the double digits are, whether it's a 1 and a 0 or a 9 and a 9, because there's a huge spread there. But I mean, the oil companies work very closely with all the teams now. Petronas, you mentioned, is a big part of Mercedes' success. Shell and Ferrari, that's a long association. So I think there are real gains to be made on the fuel and lube side, as they say.
We always hear, don't we, that Mercedes and Ferrari and everybody else, Honda, Renault as well, are getting it. And it's not a very well understood science.
It's not, and everyone's sort of throwing around these figures at the moment that we've got close to 50% thermal efficiency with the engines, and and that's about how much of the fuel being burnt up is actually being used as power. And Mercedes, remember at Monza last year, managed to rush through that engine development purely because they had that new fuel from Petronas that allowed that new engine to to be used and to come in early. So Honda are the only, or McLaren I should say, the only team on the grid using a Honda engine. So having that relationship with Exxon is very important.
Okay, let's look at the rest of the grid, shall we? Everybody else from Williams, Force India, the new Sauber, Toro Rosso as well. Which teams do we expect to be kind of making up the numbers, and who's going to be actually in the points regularly?
I've got to say, I think Toro Rosso look magnificent. The car looks bolted on track. Medium to fast stuff, it looks great. Slow speed stuff, traction looks fantastic. I think they're going to be up there fighting 4th place. Williams are going to struggle to hold on to 3rd. I really wonder if they've plateaued and it's as good as it's going to get for them, because they were flattered last year by Red Bull's problems. They should never ordinarily have stayed in 3rd place. But I think we're going to have a really good fight. Williams, maybe Force India in there as well, but certainly Williams, Red Bull, Toro Rosso around that 3rd, 4th place fight. I'm really excited about that.
Anthony?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. The one team that I think will improve is Red Bull, because they've got engine development in the pipeline. They're going to take on some of their own engine development on the Tag Heuer power unit, as we must now call it. And the sheer capability of that team as a race team, I think, is undiminished. It's just that they've had 2 seasons or 1 season of really bad engine performance, and perhaps it'll be difficult again this year. But I think they're still absolutely operationally fantastic race team, and the chassis looks nailed on. 2 great drivers again. I think Red Bull by the end of the season, I believe, will be right up there again.
You noticed how nobody at Red Bull is allowed to say the word Renault engine. It's always our engine suppliers, and I mean, who are they going to blame if they don't get the grunt from the Renault engine? Sorry, the Tag Heuer.
Tag Heuer, yes, exactly. I think that's because there was so much uncertainty over who the engine supplier was. They all got used to just saying our engine supplier, just because then it didn't matter who it was.
I must say, I think Red Bull didn't do themselves any favours last year with the way they handled that whole situation. I think a year away from the politics would serve them well, just to get on with focusing on what they did very well once, which was just run a very lean race team and dominate, and they need to get back to doing that.
And also be so good at marketing and drawing fans in. I think they're very chastened by the fan reaction to them last year, and the unsportsmanlike behaviour that they showed.
Okay, and towards the back, where do you think will be? We've spoken about Sauber. Well, Sauber, Haas F1, Manor. Do you think it'll be those 3?
I think if Haas can put race distances together, there's no reason why they shouldn't be up there competing with the likes of Renault and Sauber. Unfortunately, I think Manor, despite getting the Mercedes engine, the Williams gearbox, I still think they're going to be back row.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, sad to say, I think McLaren are in that sort of lower group. I think Manor are actually in a little zone of their own down the bottom, because they're about 2 seconds off what anybody else is doing. Even though their performance has improved, they're still quite a way off the rest of the pack. But I think McLaren, sadly, are down in that sort of lower order of team, just in terms of pace at the moment.
Okay, well, 2 of the things to come out of this second test were Ferrari's attempt at the halo head protection concept and the ever-changing qualifying format. Before we get to qualifying, let's start with the former, shall we? We saw Ferrari's own in-house design, which has really split the opinion of the paddock with a halo head protection concept, hasn't it? But first, here's what Red Bull team principal Christian Horner had to say about it after Kimi Räikkönen tried it on day 3.
I think it's good that teams are trying it. We've tried it on our simulator and so on. We're concerned with some visibility issues on it. Of course, safety and head protection is, crucial importance. Personally, I'm not a fan of that system. I think we can do better than that with something a bit more elegant. rather than a big piece of carbon fibre right in front of the driver's face.
Well, following that interview and Ferrari's experiment, drivers past and present voiced their opinions on social media. Sky Sports' own Martin Brundle had this to say via Twitter. He said, "That looks even worse than I feared." Then the Mercedes drivers came out with their own conflicting opinions, with Lewis Hamilton describing it as the worst looking mod in F1 history. But former Marussia driver Max Chilton joined Nico Rosberg in praise of the concept. Well, first of all, Will, is it the worst looking F1 mod ever? I can think of some X-wings and some wings that have been terrible wings.
Ran a little wing at the front, which was banned because it obscured the driver's view. There was a joke this morning. The ugliest F1 mods in history is Ben Hunt, who has appeared on this show many times. But sorry, Ben. But no, and look, I think it's really important. We shouldn't get carried away with this. If we look at what was put onto the Ferrari, it was a carbon mock-up of a very basic, embryonic almost version of what a halo could be. And I think what shocked is that it looked nothing like the wonderful renders that we'd seen from Mercedes, yes, which were very polished and quite beautiful. What the FIA put in, and if you look through the documentation, the prescribed diameter of what they wanted, it was 53 mil steel bars. Why 53 mil steel bars? That's what you make a roll cage out of. So it's incredibly basic, almost rudimental design on what this thing could be. And I think we shouldn't get carried away saying that's what it's going to look like. It's hideous. It's the first step on a much larger ladder towards improved head safety.
Okay, but presumably they've made it, and you're right, it looks like 3 scaffolding poles welded together, doesn't it? But presumably they've done that because that's what will sustain the impact of, say, a tyre bouncing down the track or a nose cone.
I actually think it looks like a giant pretzel, but
or a wishbone, chicken wishbone.
I mean, it's just. I mean, visually it's awful. I don't think anybody thinks it looks good. And one of the central appeals of Formula One is the aesthetic beauty of the sport, and it's a real detriment to that actually. However, put that against Jules Bianchi style accident or Justin Wilson in IndyCar. Head injuries are the most serious life-threatening injuries that happen to drivers now. It's the big concern for drivers and the sports safety governors. Something's going to happen in this area. We're going to see it this season or next. So I think we're just going to have to get used to it.
And yet, you and I were talking to Nico Hülkenberg last night, and he said the risk is something that I take on board, and it's that risk versus rewards. For these guys, is that reward greater because there is that risk involved? And if they're willing to accept that risk, should it be taken away?
Well, Lewis Hamilton agrees with him and says that if they put it on his car, he'll, quote, take it off himself. But is the genie out of the bottle on this one? Now that we've seen it, or a mock-up, can they say, okay, we've got this that could save a life, but actually we're not going to use it?
But then why is it in every mock-up of a futuristic Formula One car we see a canopy? We don't see this. It feels like a halfway house. It's neither one thing nor another. If we're going to go full head protection, let's go canopies and have it as an intrinsic part of the car from the root of design. This just feels like a retrofitted... It feels like a second thought.
Okay, let's move on to the other big topic we've had over this last couple of days of testing, and that's been the ever-changing qualifying format. Do we even know where we are? We seem to think the World Council have gone back to...
Yeah, the original... Which is a shame, because I quite like the watered-down version, because the Q3 with 8 cars on track seemed like it would be quite cool. I know I'm in the minority. I really like the idea of this elimination qualifying. It's not too different to what we already have. We already have an elimination-style qualifying. It's just the frequency with which the cars are eliminated is increased, thus the pressure is increased. I don't think it's a bad thing. If people complain Formula One's got boring races, it follows that that's because the qualifying is predictable. So if predictable qualifying begets predictable racing, let's do something which might, and it is only might, it's not guaranteed, jumble up that grid order on Sunday a bit.
I find it mind-boggling. I find the whole thing terribly depressing. I really wish it was never even being talked about. I find the twists and turns of the story, incremental development, just not possible to follow, and I don't care. So something that worked really well in Formula One has been tampered with, and now we're going to change it. For nobody even knows why it's happening.
But the argument went, if it was working so well, why were the races predictable? Because the fastest cars start at the front and disappear off into the distance.
Formula One is. I don't have a problem
exactly.
with that. I've never had a problem with
you know what the difference is though? It's like it's social media and news updates every minute of the day. when I was growing up, when we were all growing up, we'd get our fix of Formula One every Thursday when Autosport came out. And so all of this politicking and arguments, we only found out about it once a week when Autosport came out, or Motorsport News. That was it. Now it's every second of the day, and everyone's sick of the politics before the season has even started.
No one thought this was a problem, and it's become a problem. It's been made a problem. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's just madness. It's Formula One at its very worst. You know, this sport can represent absolute fantastic ideals, human ambition, engineering brilliance, all the rest of it. But this kind of stuff, it does itself such a disservice. It's unbelievable.
Okay, well, who knows what qualifying system we will have when we get to Melbourne in a few short days. But sadly, time has beaten us. Thank you very much, gents, to Anthony Rowlinson, editor of F1 Racing magazine, and to NBC Sports' Will Buxton. Join us on Wednesday, the 9th of March, for a development special where former Formula One technical director Mike Gascoigne and Craig Scarborough will be running the rule over all the new designs and concepts in F1 ahead of the new season. But for now, from us here in Barcelona, it's goodbye.